Good morning and welcome to Tree Summit 2021. I'm your host and MC, Rachel Mallarich, the City Forest Officer for the City of Los Angeles. I know that we're all fairly familiar with Zoom by now, but just please note that we'll be using the Q&A function to ask questions of our presenters as time permits. So if you have a question for them as they're presenting, feel free to identify them by name and put it in that Q&A section. I am so excited for the lineup we have today, and we'll be starting off our morning with, we're so fortunate to have Mayor Eric Garcetti, Board of Public Works Commissioner Teresa Villegas, and General Manager of StreetsLA, Adel Haj Khalil, to start off our morning. With that, I will hand it over to the Mayor.
Hello, I'm Mayor Eric Garcetti, and welcome to the third annual Tree Summit. Our world has changed so much since we first gathered in person in Elysian Park for this event 2 years ago. We've experienced historic wildfires, a pandemic, challenges unlike anything we ever could have imagined. But now as we move towards the end of this pandemic and the beginning of our recovery, it's so urgent for every one of us to do our part to protect this planet and secure a greener and healthier future for generations ahead. I'm grateful to StreetsLA General Manager Adel Haj Khalil and City Forest Officer Rachel Mallarich for bringing us together today, and for all the members of the city family and stakeholders who are helping to build a more just and sustainable city. And I want to give a special thank you to two partners who have helped accelerate this work over the last several months: USC President Carol Folt and the team behind the USC Urban Trees Initiative. Second, the partnership driving the Urban Forest Equity Study led by visiting scholar Vivek Chandas. Tree People, City Plants, LA Urban Center for Natural Resource Sustainability, and Accelerate Resilience Los Angeles, a project of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. I've said it before, but I'll say it again, that shade is an equity issue, and trees are the centerpiece of our strategy to achieve a green and a just city. And since January 2019, we've already planted over 46,000 trees. That's an average of 56 new trees every day. We still have plenty of work to do to achieve an equitable urban forest. We need to double down on our mission to maintain and expand our urban forest, complete our tree inventory, build an urban forestry management plan, and reach the ambitious targets that are laid out in LA's Green New Deal. That's why my proposed budget includes an additional $4 million towards planting trees in low canopy, low income communities. It's a down payment on our goal to plant 90,000 trees by the end of this year, and to grow the tree canopy by at least 50% in areas of greatest need by 2028. Of course, trees require water to grow, thrive, and shade our city, and I'm proud of the work we're doing to build a sustainable water future, including through our use of recycled water. I know our city urban forestry teams will be talking today about trees and water, considering the science, and planning strategically for the future. And I look forward to working with all of you to plant the seeds for that future together. Thank you so much for being here and for your partnership. We'll see you next year.
And now we have Commissioner Teresa Villegas to share a few words.
Thank you, Mayor Garcetti, and thank you, Rachel, for setting the stage this morning. The sun came out. It's a beautiful day. I heard the birds chirping, and we're going to have a great tree summit. Welcome, everyone. Today, May 21st. This year, we are holding the Tree Summit as we near the city's celebration of National Public Works Week. And our theme for this year is Stronger Together. And no one in the city works harder than Team Trees, which span across departments, as well as several different bureaus under the Board of Public Works. It definitely takes a team effort to plant and maintain trees in our urban forest, from our city forest officer, Rachel Mallarich, to planting and watering crews in our bureaus and nonprofit partners. Trees, as you all know, and that's why you're all here, they're an integral part of the work that the Department of Public Works does. They represent our city's green living infrastructure, and the only kind of infrastructure that appreciates over time. You've probably heard something about trees and the role that they play fighting climate change. We speak of their virtues in heat mitigation, shade creation, greenhouse gas reduction, air quality, and overall environmental health and well-being. But trees also play a role in water conservation. They capture, store rainfall in canopy, and prevent flooding and release water into the atmosphere through our evaporization. In addition, tree roots, leaf litters, those create natural soil conditions that allow for the rainfall to percolate into our soil and just be a natural filter for stormwater runoff. These conditions created by trees means less investment in physical infrastructure and clean water when runoff reaches the rivers and the ocean. And as chair of the LA River Watershed Area Stakeholder Committee, I know very well the benefits that trees bring for our water quality. With the passage of LA County's Safe Clean Water Measure, we also know that Measure W and LA County residents have local funds for projects to increase water supply, improve water quality, and just provide an overall community benefit for everyone. And I'm sure that you all heard that just last week, the governor announced $5 billion for the entire state to address the pending water shortage. Because of lack of water, and it's always cyclical, I am pleased that the governor is allocating funds for local governments to address this problem in real time. In Los Angeles, we have the opportunity to use county funds as well as we're able to complete water quality and conservation projects. Combined with our city's Proposition O, and O is for ocean, coupled with our local measure, we are in good place just to leverage more funds for the city of Los Angeles. Green streets represent one kind of project for which we are using this funding to capture water and improve the quality of the stormwater runoff. In these projects, physical changes to streets and infrastructures, such as underground cisterns, are combined with new trees and plants to capture and slow and filter stormwater. A number of collaborative green stormwater infrastructure projects have already been completed around the city, including the Westwood Greenway project that you will hear more about today, and with many more in the pipeline. I am dedicated to ensuring the city's builds this kind of multi-benefit projects to help us attain climate and water goals for the mayor's Green New Deal. With that, I will pass the virtual podium back to Rachel. Thank you. Enjoy today.
Thank you, Commissioner Villegas. And with that, we'll hear from General Manager and Executive Director of StreetsLA, Adel Haj-Khalil.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Great to be with you. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mayor Garcetti. It's exciting. This is the third Tree Summit. I remember when we did the first one. When I came to StreetsLA, it was all about really bringing integration, bringing enhancing the quality of life for every community, for everyone. And our mission was to enhance the quality of life for all, making our streets safe, mobile, and sustainable. You know, streets connect people, but trees protect us. As we're facing the climate change, drought, and we're facing many things, and the increasing temperature and heat, what we need is shade, and the mayor talked about shade as a critical element, but trees do more. Cleans the air, it provides us the stormwater capture, infiltration, it enhances our life, it protects our life, it's life. And you know, the theme of today's summit is trees plus water equals science. I couldn't think of a better title. It's just all about who I am and my team and what we do, whether when I was in sanitation or coming to StreetsLA, I brought all these things into the work we do. And I have a great team, both when I was working in sanitation. I know Ryan and the team is here, but also my team from Rachel working with me as a partner at the Board of Public Works, and the team in urban forestry, Dave Miranda, our chief sustainability officer, Greg Spots, Hector Benuelos, Melinda Geyer. I can name everyone. Everyone has been great to doing this. But really, what we need to do right now is to double down and do more. Trees are at the heart of equity, trees at the heart of our resiliency, trees at the heart of our climate adaptation. We are doing that through this tree inventory that we're working hard on finishing. It's amazing what we're learning. We're also integrating cool pavement with trees. You're going to hear more about it, how we're trying to cool our neighborhoods. We're building projects across the city that integrate shade, shelter, vision zero, stormwater capture. The Broadway Manchester project that we're doing, active transportation project, is integrating stormwater capture, shade, shelter, and Vision Zero and active transportation, mobile bikeways, etc. This is the future, and we are working hard with the California Transportation Commission to maximize grants coming to us. So we're seeing grants coming. We just got one up in the valley around the Orange Line connection. It's also a multi-benefit solution that has bioswales, shade, bikeways to connect people, to connect what I call the dots, drops, and hearts. This is all about what we do. And we can no longer plan our work just as a single purpose. It has to be multi-benefit. We have to leverage resources. And the biggest thing, and have you heard me talk about the 3 I's: integration, innovation, and inclusion. And the biggest I of all of them are the inclusion. And that's a commitment we all have. And that's why we're here today. It's about inclusion, working together. And great to see everyone here, because we are doing this not for us right now, but I think we will benefit from it, but it's for our future. And you can really be proud that what we're doing is transforming our city, transforming our community, the earth we live in, for a better place for our children, grandchildren to live, to be safe, to thrive, to be healthy. And you are playing a huge role in it. We have in the budget, I'm so proud of the budget and what the mayor has provided us in the budget, and through the Budget and Finance Committee, the chair, Paul Krokoyan, and our Public Works Committee chair, and also on the Budget and Finance Committee, Bob Blumenfield. They really stood at your calling to invest more in trees. So in the budget, we have $4 million for more tree planting. We have also additional crews for tree trimming, for what I call the tree care, planting crews, watering crews. And also we have staff to really protect our the protection of our additional tree species and the protected trees, and what we're trying to do to make sure that every tree is protected as much as we can, and to make every way to protect those trees. And we have now the resources, we have the environmental resources to ensure that the CEQA process, the environmental process, is done appropriately. I know Rachel has some staff in support of it. Also, our partners at Rec Parks have restored additional staff for caring of the trees and their parkways. In the budget that was just approved yesterday, 120 green positions were approved to support the urban forestry. That's amazing. That's a huge investment. That's in addition to the money we did for our inventory. Now we have money for tree planting, and we're going to partner with everyone to make sure we double down. You heard the mayor talk about the 46,000 trees that have been planted. We will do more, but the only way for it to do it is through collaboration. So I'm very grateful to everyone, and the mayor, the council, for approving the budget and supporting us, and your advocacy. Your calls have been listened to, and we are moving, I believe, in a great direction. I have not seen a budget hearing where we've had more discussion about trees and tree protection and everything we need to do. And this is really the future, because everyone knows trees saves lives, and trees are a critical part of our green infrastructure. Trees are critical for our breathing, for our air, for our water, for the shade, for equity. It's all about life. So with that, I'm just honored to have been with you on this journey to really protect and enhance our urban forest. Together we can make it better and we're going to do it as we work together in collaboration. So thank you for our partners here. Thank you, Jonathan, for your advocacy on the Westwood Greenway. Thank you, Dr. Lakin and the USC team for being part of this. I'm grateful to my team, my staff. Rachel, thank you for your partnership. Commissioner Villegas, your leadership on Measure W, your leadership on protecting trees and really getting in and helping advocate for the linkage between trees and water is just amazing. I'm very grateful to you. I'm very grateful to our Board of Public Works President, Greg Good, for his leadership, and also our friend from before, Kevin James, who really stood for trees every single day and really wanted that to be done. And that was something that he stood for. So I'm very grateful to all of you. As the mayor said, let's plant the seeds, but I would say let's dig in today and let's move on. So grateful, good luck, and I'm honored to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adele, for offering that perspective on the current budget and where we are from your perspective this year. And I agree that I feel so fortunate to be on a team with you and Commissioner Villegas as some real heavy hitters when it comes to looking at water. It's so important, which is why it's our theme for today. And so I'm really overflowing with things I want to share with our stakeholders today. I'm so fortunate to be in this role of City Forest Officer and have the ability to work with so many of you that are passionate about our urban forest. There's a lot of great work being done that we can share and celebrate. I want to start off by saying thank you to the city departments and staff, similar to Adele, that have worked with me over the past year on addressing issues related to our urban forest. We have talented and dedicated staff across the city within Recreation and Parks, StreetsLA, LA Sanitation and the Environment, Bureau of Engineering, LADWP, City Planning, and Building and Safety that have all actively engaged in addressing issues in both policies and programs that impact our trees, and we're making progress. To our leadership, to the mayor for setting and supporting such big goals within the Green New Deal. Mayor Garcetti, your leadership has attracted the key partnerships that you mentioned and that are helping us get more and more clear on the investments and strategies needed to have an equitably distributed and healthy urban forest for our residents. To Commissioner Villegas and the other members of the Board of Public Works, I'm so grateful for your support of the urban forest, your willingness to ask really difficult questions, and overall leadership on this issue. Our city council members, as reflected in this budget cycle as well, your continued awareness of our urban forestry issues and leadership in investing those resources and on looking for policy improvements is really essential to our success. And Adele, your openness and dedication to the themes of integration, innovation, and inclusion encapsulate exactly what is needed for us to move forward. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our nonprofit partners who are doing great work serving our communities and getting the message out about the benefits of trees through amazing urban forestry projects and education. We can't get to our urban forestry goals without all of you and your partnership. And thank you to all of you who showed up today. Those of you who have individually shown up to engage and get educated on trees and some of the complexities of urban forest management. And I want to say a particular thank you to our Community Forestry Advisory Committee, especially our Chair, Shelley Billick, and Vice Chair, Isabel Duvivier, for their partnership and ongoing feedback that they provide as we look to improve our urban forest. The strides the city is making towards local water sources is critical to the conversation we're having today. But today we're going to be focusing on some of the basics, what trees need and how they function, considerations to ensure that investments in the urban forest are achieving the types of benefits that we need, and what an actual project that is implemented with community feedback and significant involvement looks like. Water influences the decisions we make for the urban forest, whether it be in terms of our site conditions. And when I say site conditions, I'm talking about the ground in which we're planting the trees. And I have to say a thank you to Councilmember Koretz for his leadership in pushing us to think about healthy soils, and to Tree People for their work on the Healthy Soils for Healthy Communities initiative over the past year. We have to be thinking about the space in which that we're planting trees and how we improve those conditions, because we know that that's essential to tree health over the long term. When it comes to tree selection, we need to think about tree selection in the different contexts, whether it's park space, on our private properties, or our street trees. And we've been working very closely over the past year with renowned landscape architect Bob Perry on tree selection criteria and species for healthy, long-lived trees that will perform well in the challenging conditions found particularly in our street tree locations as we look at our current and changing climate. We also have to think about the best approach for establishment care. That is the first 5 years of watering and maintenance that trees need to get started as trees in the urban forest. And at a future Lunch and Learn session, I'm hoping to share the work being done by Koreatown Youth and Community Center, City Plants, and Davie Resource Group, supported by funding from LEDWP and the California Natural Resources Agency, to look at different watering practices for young trees and how we can be supplying the right amount of water at the right times to really achieve that healthy growth for our young trees. All of this is underlined by a desire to ensure that these investments truly result in the needed benefits and protections for our communities, which is why I'm grateful for the development of the Urban Trees Initiative at USC under the leadership of Mayor Garcetti and President Folt. And I'm excited for you to hear about the work they've been doing in partnership with us. And lastly, the engagement with you all as key actors in the urban forest. We're going to hear about a project that included a multi-departmental approach and heavy involvement from the community. As part of the development of our first urban forest management plan, we will be considering how to engage Angelenos during times of drought and ensure that messages for water conservation include consideration of the needs of our trees. That will be work that we need to do together with you as stakeholders who know our urban landscape and our neighborhoods, our communities, our residents. And in the coming year, we'll be looking at thinking through and debating what are the right actions and messages and how they will be deployed. But today I'm asking us to begin by getting very clear and rooting ourselves in science, whether this is new information for you or a refresher on how trees use water and are impacted by drought. One of the challenges of urban forest management, particularly in Los Angeles, is the multiple jurisdictions and audiences that we have to address when we look at actions around the urban forest. Developing policies and implementing programs that reach across those jurisdictions to achieve the desired outcomes for healthy trees. We're going to have to message and mobilize across the city for those different audiences, whether it be, again, actions in our park space, along business corridors, in residential neighborhoods, whether it's by renting communities or ones that have a lot of home ownership. We're going to have to work together to ensure that we're prepared when we have times of drought. And resilient communities are those that are connected. So I'm grateful for those of you who are showing up to connect with us here today and through our other venues where we're discussing the urban forest and our urban forest management plan. So that's me framing our conversation for today. And I'd like to warm you up a little bit. Hopefully you've got your coffee, you're ready to settle in and listen to our first presenter. But first we're going to do a couple polls. And just to get you kind of warmed up and engaged. So we'll go ahead and have the first poll come up. And this is thinking about your own water use. And we'll give you probably about a minute to do this. And so we're going to do 3 polls. So we're going to give you about a minute for this one, or we'll see what the response rate looks like. From your perspective in your household, what is your biggest use of water? Just off the top of your head this morning on Friday, May 21st, what do you think is your biggest use of water? And while we're waiting for your responses to come in, I'll give a shout out to Melinda Geyer, who is our the one driving the polls and the PowerPoints today. We would not be here without the support of the StreetsLA external relations team, particularly Melinda and Elise. So Melinda, do you think we're ready? If you think we're ready, we can close the poll. So we have coming in at 36%, at least on my screen. I know we're not seeing it on the shared projection, but on my screen, I'm seeing that the participants today are seeing hygiene as the highest water use, followed closely by landscaping and laundry. So let's go to poll number 2, and we'll give you about a minute to do that as well. While we're waiting for that to come up, poll number 2 is, when you think about trees and drought, your first thought is, and it's okay, we're just going to pick one. what best represents your first thought when you think about trees in a time of drought? I'm going to give you about, say, 15 more seconds, unless, Melinda, you see that we've got enough participants that have responded. All right, let's see if we can see those results. Number one response on this one, we should be exploring local water sources like recycled gray water or stormwater, coming in at 38%, followed by trees are going to die, which hopefully won't be the case, but definitely might be an early reaction for someone thinking about trees in a time of drought. And I'm not saying we're in a drought now, but we're talking about the cycles of drought we have here in Los Angeles and how we can be better prepared for them. The third place one I'll put in, planting trees alongside native drought tolerant plants is a good use of water, even in a drought, with 13%, and then low water use drought tolerant tree species will be fine at 11%. All right, Melinda, we're ready for the final poll, and I'll share with you guys that this one has a little bit longer list. So you might want to scroll down and see all the options, and you can pick more than one. So if we have specific guidelines for caring trees in times of drought, what is the best way to communicate that information to the public? And again, we may have many conversations about what this looks like, but this is just to get us kind of warmed up and get your feedback and thinking on this Friday morning. So again, feel free to scroll down and look at the options that go beyond that first box and select as many as you think would be those best ways to communicate information to the public. I'll give you about a minute for that, and then I'm going to pass it to our first presenter. About 10 more seconds, and then we're going to see those results and see what you all are thinking. All right, let's close that poll. Number one at 65% is social media, followed by messaging shared by local and corporate nurseries and plant distributions like a Home Depot or Lowe's. And it looks like the third place option is, in a tie actually for second, is incentives encouraging proper tree care, training for landscape professionals and gardeners, and neighborhood councils, PSA. There's a lot of enthusiasm about a number of these options, which is great. And we will probably have to use multiple avenues to get the word out. All right, I have taken enough time, and so I'm going to get us ready for our first speaker. Thank you all for sharing some early feedback. Hopefully that got your brain kind of thinking. We are so fortunate to have Igor Lacan. He is a University of California Cooperative Extension Advisor for the San Francisco Bay Area, specializing in urban forestry. I've gotten a chance to hear Igor speak a number of times on tree-related issues, and I'm so excited that he's able to join us here this morning. So Igor, feel free to take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Rachel and Melinda. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Melinda and Rachel, I presume you will wave at me or scream at me if something goes wrong, like the sound or the internet. And I have a spare internet here that we can switch to if things really go sideways. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for the kind introduction. And yes, we can go on to the next slide and give you just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. We'll talk about trees and water. And we'll talk about what trees do with water, what happens when there isn't enough water, which is the drought, how trees recover from the drought, because this is one of the key messages. Trees actually evolved with periodic droughts. And if you think about it, any long-lived plant has to be able to deal with periodic lack of water. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about some practical considerations about how to provide water for trees. And before we start, I get to do a little bit of an editorial. And so this is my editorial about trees and water. The first thing to keep in mind is that trees need water. They don't need a lot of water, but they need some water. And there is a difference between not providing any water at all and providing a little bit of water to actually get the trees through the drought. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's not a all or nothing kind of thing. And this is because water is integral to tree growth, which then provides us with benefits. And those benefits are very large and they're irreplaceable. And I think we have an entire presentation about tree canopy and benefits of tree canopy. So just keep that in mind. This water is an investment in those tree benefits. And the other thing to keep in mind is that trees usually recover from droughts. Again, they've evolved to deal with periodic droughts. And the one thing to keep in mind here is that heat makes that recovery much more difficult, and we'll talk about that. So if you are expecting to have a hot drought, and spoiler alert, we are expecting to have hot droughts pretty much from now on, then it's good to prepare for that and be ready to provide some water. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see that more droughts is really what we're expecting for our future climate. But at the same time, our landscapes are based on our previous climate or on our old normal. So we do need to do a little bit of work to adapt our ideas, how we think about what to plant, where to plant, and how to maintain trees, as well as to adapt the species we plant. And if we go on to the next slide, this is the final editorial comment. We do need to have a conversation about water. And it's really the idea that water that's used for trees is an investment in those trees. And it helps us get to a sustainable, really a sustainable environment, which is going to look very different from the environment before the settlement pre-1770. And that's fine. It's a different situation now. We will have a different environment. And of course, a number of people already mentioned the issue of new water. So what kind of new water is locally available? Is it gray water? Is it recycled water? And what do you need to do to start using those new water sources? And finally, the thing to remember is that new trees, newly planted trees, and mature trees have very different watering requirements. And we'll touch on that a little bit. But if you know what those are, then you can, again, provide water in the most efficient way. So let's go on to the next slide, and you'll see the overview again. So let's first talk about what trees do with water, why trees need water. So on the next slide, you'll see the kind of a diagram of what plants do with water. So the first thing plants do with water is they create that pressure against cell walls to hold themselves up. This is called turgor, impress your friends and family. And the first sign that a plant doesn't have enough water is the wilting of that plant, because again, there's not enough pressure against the cell walls to keep them up. Now, woody plants, of course, evolved wood, so the entire tree doesn't kind of collapse, but you can certainly see this in the leaves. And what's interesting is even a very small lack of water will cause that wilting. You can see this in most plants every afternoon. In a really warm climate, you can see that the plants are struggling to maintain that water pressure. The second thing that plants do with water is they move things around. They use water as a medium to move around the products of photosynthesis, and we'll talk a lot about that. So the sugars they produce in the leaves, they move into the trunk and into the roots, and to move minerals they absorb from the soil into the trunk and into the leaves. So that's the transport of solutes. And then the third thing that plants do with water is photosynthesis. And this is very important. So just a reminder, what is photosynthesis? Well, if we go on to the next slide, you will have your high school biology picture of what photosynthesis is. It's a chemical reaction that takes water and carbon dioxide from the air, combines them, uses light energy to combine them, and creates sugar, which then plants turn into all kinds of other things, including secondary compounds they use to defend themselves from insect and disease attacks. So you get the sugar, but you also get the oxygen, which is why we're here. This is why it's the reason we're able, it's the reason for me that I'm able now to produce all this hot air talking to you. It's thanks to the plants that have released all that oxygen over the many millions of years. The thing to realize here is that water goes into that very photosynthetic equation. So if you don't have water as a plant, then you cannot do photosynthesis, you cannot make sugar. And that sugar, remember, is carbon. When we talk about carbon sequestration, this is the moment where that happens, where the plant takes that CO2 out of the air and turns it into the sugar, which then it can turn into starch or cellulose, which is essentially wood. So without water, there is no carbon sequestration. Now, to actually absorb that carbon dioxide, you can see that arrow coming into the plant needs to open little pores in the leaves, which are called stomates. And in doing so, it is essentially agreeing to some amount of water being lost from the leaf. So the plant is not only using the water for the photosynthetic reaction itself, but is actually losing a bit of water when it opens the photosynthetic pore to let in carbon dioxide. So we'll keep in mind this photosynthesis thing. The plant has to use up some water to do photosynthesis, and then it has to lose a little bit of water just to absorb that carbon dioxide. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see a schematic of what this whole thing looks like. So if you imagine water, molecules of water, H2O, and you can see the little red oxygens and yellow hydrogens, H2O, moving into the plant. It moves into the roots, goes through the trunk, and then leaves the plant out of that stomatal pore in the leaves. And it's really an unbroken chain of water molecules that's being pulled out of the plant by the pull of transpiration. And this, I'm sure you've heard this term. Transpiration is that water loss out of the leaves through those little stomatal pores. Trees can control this. They can, if they need to, close that stomatal pore, and that will stop the water loss. It will also stop them from absorbing carbon dioxide, so it'll essentially stop photosynthesis. But if they need to, they can close the stomates and stop water movement. They have a lot less control over what happens in the soil. The movement of water from the soil into the roots is largely passive. It's mostly by this gradient, which is a little bit hard to visualize. But in essence, water moves from a place where there is more water to a place where there is less water. And in this case, it's sort of falling upwards into the roots, through the stem, and out the stomatal pore into the air. It's just hard for us to picture because it's kind of going the wrong way, but it's essentially falling down the gradient of what they call water potential. Okay, and that soil moisture reservoir really, if you think about it, acts as a fuel tank, and the transpiration really is your kind of consumption rate of that fuel. I know it's a little corny, but it's a useful way to think about it. So if you keep this image in mind, what happens when there isn't enough water? And it turns out there are two bad things that are going to happen. If we go on to the next slide, the first really bad thing that can happen is for that chain of water molecules to get broken, and essentially for air to enter into those water conducting vessels. And if that happens, the plant has an embolism. And it sounds scary, and it is scary, because as soon as you've broken that water column, water movement stops. And so plants really try very, very hard to prevent this kind of a thing from happening. And one of the ways they do this is by having these very elaborate water conducting systems. So it's not just a straight pipe running up and down the tree. It's much more elaborate. And I'm showing you what conifers do because I think it's really cool. Broadleaf trees have a different mechanism for controlling these embolisms, but we could spend all day on this because it's really cool. But in conifers, water is going to move through these little sieve plates from one vessel element to the next. So instead of having just a straight pipe, you have these kind of perforated little plates that water has to navigate. Why do they do that? That sounds really stupid. Why would you do that? Well, they do it so that if there is an embolism in one of these vessel elements, there are these little, it's like a little disc inside the perforated plate. And as soon as there's air on one side of the little disc just slams shut. And you can see that in this diagram. You can see the little disc is like a gong suspended in the passageway and just slams shut and prevents that embolism, prevents the air from spreading and damaging the entire vessel. So plants really have gone out of their way to prevent these air embolisms from really kind of stopping water movement everywhere. And again, broadleaf plants have a different mechanism. They have these bags that they inflate into the vessels. They're called tyloses, again, to prevent the air embolism from moving around. So this is one bad thing that can happen, especially if you have a rapid, very, very severe drought. This is what you end up with. Now, if you have a sort of longer term drought, then what the plant can do, if we go to the next slide, the plant, remember I said they can close their stomatal pore, they can just stop the water movement. That's useful because it prevents these air embolisms from forming. But the problem is at that point you've stopped photosynthesizing. And if you do this long enough, you're going to starve as a plant, because remember, plants feed themselves. They operate very differently from us, but they do that by photosynthesis. So if they've stopped moving water, if they've stopped absorbing carbon dioxide, they're not really able to make any new tissue. And you can see in this picture what happens. Long-term water stress will lead to a reduction in growth. And if you do this long enough, we go to the next slide, you can actually see it. You can see it on trees. We must have skipped the slide, but that's okay. You can see this on conifers because conifers often have they keep their leaves from year to year to year, and you can see how during a drought year those leaves will be smaller, kind of undersized, simply because the tree did not have enough water and therefore could not make enough energy to grow those leaves to their full size. The same thing happens in broadleaf trees. It's just harder to see because they lose their leaves every year. But this is the recap. So if you have, and this is one of those academic graphs where you have to kind of look at it sideways to get what's going on. But on the vertical axis, they're talking about the intensity of the drought. And on the horizontal axis, they're talking about the duration. So if you have a long drought that's not overly severe, you're going to end up with carbon starvation. You're simply not going to be able to make enough sugar. Eventually, all of the energy reserves will be depleted and the tree will slowly decline and die. If you have a severe, quick drought, then what you end up with is that air embolism, the water movement stops, and you end up with this hydraulic failure. And again, if you want to impress your friends, symplastic failure is the failure of the actual cells. So very scary, very bad. But we talked about the fact that this happens every so often, right? Droughts happen. So trees must have ways to cope with them, and they do. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about how trees recover from drought. So again, if we go on to the next slide, you'll see a really interesting diagram from Nadine Roer and colleagues. Now, don't panic, there's a lot of lines here, but remember, there are two basic systems that you have to recover. You have to recover your photosynthetic machine and your gas exchange. Remember those stomates that have closed, you got to open them, right, to allow that gas exchange and allow carbon dioxide back in. That's one system. The other system is the water conducting system. We talked a lot about that. So in this graph, the photosynthetic system is in green and the water conducting system is in blue. And what they're showing, they're essentially saying water system, they're just looking at problems. So as long as you're at zero, you're okay. There's no problem with water conduction and distribution. And if you look at this graph overall, you have stress, you have a drought, and you see how one line dips down really quickly. That's the gas exchange. Remember, I said that when a tree doesn't have enough water, the first thing it'll do, it'll just close the stomates, to stop losing water. And that stops the entry of carbon dioxide into the leaf, stops that gas exchange. You see that right away. But you also see that that helps the tree not have any problems with the water conduction distribution. The blue lines, they stay the zero problems. And you also see that as soon as the recovery starts, the stomates open, gas exchange resumes, and everything is essentially hunky-dory. And the way you know things are hunky-dory is you look at that gray line. There's a flat gray line at the very top. That's the sugar reserves. So the question is, did the tree lose any substantial reserves of energy? And the answer is no, because the drought didn't last very long. Okay. Now, what happens if you have a long and severe drought? So the next slide, you'll see the lines go crazy. Slide. There we go. So this is just an explosion of lines. So what you see here is what happens in a long severe drought. And there is a little bit of a vicious circle here. So you see that solid green line, gas exchange, with flows to stomates, gas exchange is stopped. Okay, well, that means that after a while, our photosynthetic machine is going to stop working because it doesn't have any carbon dioxide to work on. That's the dashed green line. And you can see it's a little slower to stop working, but eventually it stops working. And then, because this is a severe drought, remember that pull on the water molecules, you're beginning to create embolisms. And you see the blue lines, the problems with water conduction and distribution, those problems come up. So this is bad. Okay, so now we're going to recovery. Water comes back, rain comes back, we have a recovery. Well, look at what sort of happens. So the gas exchange recovers just like it did before. The tree opens up stomates, starts picking up carbon dioxide. The photosynthetic machine begins to recover, but look at the water conduction system. Look at the blue lines. They really lag. They should be dropping back down to, remember, blue lines indicate problems with water conduction. So they should be going down to zero, right? No problem. But that's not what's happening because it takes a long time for these embolisms to be repaired. In fact, we used to think that trees couldn't repair embolisms at all. That once you had an embolized water conducting vessel, that was it, you're done. We now know that they can, actually, they have mechanisms to get that air bubble out of the water conducting vessel. But it takes a long time, and some vessels really cannot be repaired. And so the tree needs to build new vessels. Now it can do that, right? It can grow new tissue, build new vessels. But to do that, and this is the kind of a vicious circle, it needs that sugar from photosynthesis. And remember, to do photosynthesis, you need water up there in the leaf. So you need the working vessels to get the water up. But you don't have the working vessels because you've embolized them. So you've got to build new ones, but you can't build new ones because you don't have enough sugar, because you can't get the water up to the photosynthetic machine, and so on. So you see how this interaction between water conduction problems and damaged photosynthetic machine just means that it'll take a long time for trees to recover from severe drought. And some of that recovery might not be 100% complete. So, does it get worse? Yes, it gets a little bit worse. And that's because we didn't really talk about the heat. Now, heat, essentially, the thing to remember is heat makes everything worse. And if we look at the heat situation on the next slide, heat makes everything worse in at least 3 different ways. One is this idea of vapor pressure deficit. Again, impress your friends. This is really the way that trees feel the air. So we feel relative humidity, trees feel the vapor pressure deficit. And the thing to realize here is that as the vapor pressure deficit increases, demand for water increases. And at the same relative humidity, all you need to do is increase the temperature, and you're going to increase the vapor pressure deficit. So without doing anything to the amount of water in the air, if we show the next slide, you'll see the numbers for VPD go way up. So the plant is really losing a lot more water. Think about that chain of molecules. It's being pulled through the plant much faster at 90 Fahrenheit than it would be at 60 Fahrenheit, even with the same amount of water. Now, at the same time, there isn't the same amount of water available to the plant. Why? Because at a higher temperature with heat, we're evaporating more water out of the soil. So there's typically going to be less water in the soil, if we go to the next slide, with heat than there would be without heat. And then finally, remember our graph with the many lines? Plants use water to cool their tissues. It's one of the major things they do with water. It's one of the reasons why they evaporate water. They're willing to lose water in order to cool their leaves. And they do that because if things get really hot, next slide, if things get above about 40 degrees Celsius, so about 160 Fahrenheit, 106 Fahrenheit, we begin to damage the photosynthetic machinery. Heat actually begins to damage the enzymes, the most important enzyme in the world called rubisco. I know it sounds like a cracker or something, but it's actually the enzyme that does the work of photosynthesis. That enzyme begins to actually be damaged at high temperatures. And at that point, things really get tricky because let's say we go into recovery. Well, you can see that we've damaged that PS2, the photosystem 2, the little part of the leaf that actually does the work, and we need to rebuild it. We can't just switch it back on because it's damaged by the heat. So that really makes recovery very, very difficult. And the thing to do really is, if we're planning for hotter droughts, is to make sure that we have some water to provide to the tree so it can cool its tissues. That's really all this is about. So that's the recovery of trees from drought. So we talked about what trees do with the water. We talked about what happens when there isn't enough water. And then we talked about what trees do to recover from drought. What I'm skipping altogether is the issue of insects and diseases. We know that some insects and diseases are in fact facilitated by the drought. And I mentioned that trees use that sugar they made in photosynthesis to create defensive compounds. So again, no sugar, no defensive compounds, more likelihood of insect or disease attack. And we're going to skip that altogether. And instead, we're going to go on to sort of look at some of the things to consider, some of the things to think about. Can we predict recovery from drought? We're working on it. But at this point, I think the fair answer is no. We've observed a number of patterns in different tree species. And this is useful for urban foresters to kind of keep track of, because ultimately we're going to have to change our tree palette based on, at least in part, this tolerance to drought. But can we really predict it right now? Probably not. So what can we do? Let's go on to the next slide. One thing we can do is be aware of how our droughts have been behaving and what our new normal is. And basically, I'll go very quickly through this. If you look at the next slide, the drought that we had from 2012, 2013 to 2016, this is from Professor Jay Lund at UC Davis. And there were a few characteristics that are useful to kind of keep in mind. It was unusually dry and unusually warm, and this was predicted to happen as rarely as once in every 1,200 years. This depleted, especially that heat, depleted the soil moisture and diminished the snowpack. And these are also rare events. On the other hand, the reductions in stream flow and precipitation that we experienced, those were not as uncommon. Those are something that happens every 15 to every 30 years. So it was a very warm drought, and that's kind of very unusual. But some of the other features of the drought were not as unusual, namely the reduction in stream flow, which then, of course, for most of us, including us in the Bay Area, leads to a reduction in water delivery. Our water comes from elsewhere. But one of the key lessons that I want to leave you with, and this is from Noah Diffenbaugh and colleagues, is that they looked at this idea of warm droughts. Do droughts have to be warm? I know Southern California, maybe folks don't think about this as much, but certainly in central Northern California, we can have droughts that are very cold when we have a winter that just doesn't have any precipitation. Well, Noah Diffenbaugh and colleagues calculated that basically from now on, every time we have a drought, it's going to be a hot drought. And that's because of global warming. I love this quote because scientists typically don't use the phrase 100% probability. It's just not the way science usually works. They'll say like 90%. These guys, they were like, nah, it's 100% sure that when we have droughts, they're going to be hot droughts. So just keep that in mind. And that brings us to this idea of what is normal. And if we go on to the next slide, these were just released. This was work by Becky Bollinger and Russ Schumacher, Colorado State University. And what they did is they asked, well, what is our normal climate? How do you know? Well, the way you know is the National Weather Service tells you what normal is. And the previous period that they looked at to get those long-term averages was the 1981 to 2010 period. So Doctors Bollinger and Schumacher said, okay, well, what if we just moved the period by 10 years over? So instead of looking at 1981 to 2010 averages, let's look at the 1991 to 2020 averages. And this we can call the Igor period because I snuck into the US of A in 1991. So this is the Igorocene. And you can see right here that as soon as I arrived, things fell apart. You can see that the last 30-year period is warmer, substantially warmer than the preceding 30-year period. And in this case, the colors indicate how many months in those, so this is 30 years, so 360 months of those 360 months, how many were warmer than in the previous 30 years. And you see in the dark orange, greater than 80 months, again, out of 360 were warmer than in the preceding 30 years. And they were also drier. So if we go on to the next slide, again, same authors, Bollinger and Schumacher. This is great work, and this was just released. This is really, really cool. You can see right away, you don't even have to read the legend, do you? You can tell right away that in the Western US, the last 30 years has been drier than the preceding years. So this is our new normal. Now, again, I'm telling you this just to remind you that a lot of our trees were planted prior to the Igorocene, right? They were planted prior to 1991. They were planted based on those previous climates. And we simply need to recalibrate our expectation of what our climate really looks like. So how do we do that? Are there any sort of practical considerations that we can kind of think about? And I think there are. So let's move on to the next slide. The first thing to realize is what you got. And I mentioned National Weather Service, love it. National Weather Service has some of the best tools for communicating what's going on. And if you go to your local Weather Service office, and this is critical, you have to be on the Weather Service office webpage, not just on your forecast webpage. So in your case, it would be weather.gov/Los Angeles. You find down there at the bottom of the page a little graph that has like squiggles, and it's right there and it says recent area temperatures and precipitation. If you click on that, we get the next slide. This is what you get. You get this two-panel graph. The top is the temperature, the bottom is the precipitation. And if you look at the top, the red, you see that shaded red, that's the record highs, shaded blue are record lows, green is the sort of average. And I can tell just by looking at this that you in Los Angeles have had at least 3 record-breaking days this year. You see that? You see where the blue, the dark blue, that's the actual record. So you can see where it bumps up against the red. Yeah, that means you're breaking records. Cool, congratulations. You've broken 3 temperature records this year. Super. The bottom panel is the cumulative rainfall graph. So you start at 0 in January and you accumulate rain over the course of the year. And you can see how that line, I outlined it in yellow. You can see how it kind of flattens out in the summer because you're not getting any rainfall in the summer. You get rainfall in the spring, you get in the fall and winter. And so that's the normal. Remember, that's kind of a questionable what that means, but that's the long-term average. Whereas that sort of kind of a fluorescent green, that's the actual amount. So you can see right here that, well, the actual is below the normal line, which means you are in deficit. And yeah, you are in deficit. If you weren't, if you were above the normal, it would be a nice, beautiful, dark green. And this is super useful, especially whether you're talking to interested residents or whether you're talking to interested elected officials, or you're just trying to get a sense of where you are. This is a great way of figuring out, okay, for my specific area, what does our water situation look like? And you can do this, again, thanks to the Weather Service, you can go about 20 years back and produce these graphs very, very easily. And if we go on to the next slide, these are the graphs for Riverside. And what I did, I made this for a presentation in Orange County. And what I asked them to tell me, I said, okay, I'll show you the last, whatever it is, 9 years worth of graphs, because that's all I could fit on the page. Tell me how many of those 9 years you think you had average rainfall, above average rainfall, below average rainfall. Just think about it. What would you have said if I had asked you that for Los Angeles? If you look at this, you can see that Riverside had a total of 1 year when it was above average, and that was 2019. And it had probably another year, let's say maybe 2017 was close to the average. All other years, Riverside was either below the long-term norm or really below the long-term norm. So these droughty earth conditions, I would argue, are our new normal. This is, when you look at this, when you look at the set of graphs, this is what a tree is experiencing. And remember, unlike us, trees remember, right? Because a tree is experiencing this from year to year to year. So great tool to just kind of get a sense from where we are. So if we go on to the next slide, I talked about how you can use this tool to look at extreme heat. So last year, for example, in Los Angeles, I didn't realize this, you had a little bit of a drought, you had a lower than average rainfall, but what you really had, you had some really hot days. Look at that here. You can see the distribution of hot, super hot days all across the year. Again, if you're talking about trees and how they deal with water deficit, this is quite important. So having these high heat events throughout the year is likely to lead to greater stress on the trees. And I think that's it for the sort of graphs and charts, I hope. Let's go to the next slide. Let's just quickly look at some of the things to consider. So moving on to the next slide, and these are just a few practical considerations. We'll go through this very quickly. The first step is to recognize the value of water for urban trees. And again, this is our friend, Professor Lund from UC Davis. He wrote a paper that looked at, he titled it, "Why was there so little economic impact from drought in California?" And he concluded that, well, it's because of a lot of water that's applied to agriculture is used to grow low-value crops. But then he also talked about urban water use, and I want everybody to look at this text really carefully. He said, well, urban water use for landscape irrigation provides little economic contribution. And when the state mandated a reduction in urban water use, those were accommodated with little economic impact, despite some inconvenience, like, the loss of trees, and et cetera, et cetera. And I said, no, wait, this is wrong. This was a catastrophe, not an inconvenience. But the problem is that what we've done is we've assigned a value of 0 to that water that we're applying to keep our urban trees alive. And if you do that, then yeah, this is what you end up with. You end up with this economic analysis that is completely wrong. And I think we all need to really think about how we shift the discussion about urban water. Because if you apply water to alfalfa, you get alfalfa out of it, and you can say, well, I've sold that alfalfa for however many dollars, that was the value of the water. But when you apply the same water to urban trees, this is what you end up with. You end up with somebody saying, well, there's no value to that. So that's wrong, and we need to shift that conversation. That's the first step. The second step, go to the next slide, is to talk about what we need to do for the trees. Again, I talked about planning. I talked about changing the palette. We do need to optimize planting sites. We talked about the importance of soil conditions, and we already, Mayor Garcetti talked about the planning for new, quote unquote, new sources of water. At the same time, it's also important to make things better for the existing trees. Next slide. And one of those ways we make things better is to provide water, and we do that in a context of sustainability. The first thing to do is to repair your irrigation system. There was a study not too long ago by my colleagues Lauren Oakey and Darren Haver, both of UC Cooperative Extension, and they found that in some places 50% of the water that was applied to plants didn't need to be applied. So there is a lot of research, well, there is some research going on, again, mostly at UC Davis and UC Cooperative Extension, on how to apply water, what would be the minimum amount of water that needs to be applied, and you can still have a landscape and you can save a very substantive proportion of the water. The second thing is to talk about turf. Do you need it? Can you give it up temporarily? Can you replace it with other water-sensitive landscaping? And the third thing is to irrigate trees efficiently, which really means to get all of that water that you're applying into the tree. And I'll show you in a moment some ways to do that. And I would just like to kind of suggest that one thing you want to do if you are a landscape manager is you want to keep the large trees alive, because those are really your advocates for what your landscapes can look like. And remember, they handled past droughts. They're probably going to handle this drought as well. They just need a little bit of help. So that's kind of I would leave you with that message. If we go on to the next slide, this is where we get some of these practical suggestions. Remember, young trees, newly planted trees, mature trees, completely different ways of applying water. For young trees, they will very quickly die if they don't have water. The upshot is that they need very little water. And so on the next slide, you'll see what that looks like. I'm not going to bore you with this, but again, it's a very small amount of water, but it does have to be applied often, especially in the Southern California climates, several times a week. So you can't go away for 3 months and then come back and apply 300 gallons and say, oh, why is this dead? I put on 300 gallons. Well, because it just can't access that water. The roots are still little. Mature trees on the next slide, completely different story. You need to refill that soil water reservoir. This was a technique that was developed by my two favorite arboriculture professionals, Nelda Matheny and Larry Costello. And we can talk about how to do this, but the bottom line, if we go on to the next slide, is you're applying a much larger amount of water, but you're not applying it very often. So you're applying it maybe once a month or even less frequently in some cases. How do you do it? You go to the California Center for Urban Horticulture at UC Davis, where they have plans and diagrams that show you how some of these water delivery devices work, the trick and the RSIC, the tree rim irrigation contraption and the rotary sprinkler irrigation contraption. And you can see why those are useful. Basically, they apply water without wasting any. That's the point.
Igor, I'm going to hop in.
Yes, you can stop me.
I could let you talk all day, like you mentioned earlier, but I do want to make sure we have a time for a couple of questions before we move on. And and I know that this is actually really fascinating for folks hearing, like, what should we do? And I think our goal moving forward is going to be working together with folks across the state to come up with really clear guidelines that are really easy for the average California resident to understand. So that's kind of some of our future work. Can I pass it to Rachel O'Leary to ask you a few questions?
Yeah, go Rachel.
Hi there. Thanks so much for that presentation here. We've got wonderful questions here from our audience that we'd love to pick your brain on. So our first is from Drew Reedy. Dr. Lacan, can you share if neighboring floristic provinces where warmer, drier droughts might occur, like the Sonoran floristic province, might provide more resilient trees for our urban forest? Also, is there any research suggesting that these trees might also provide habitat benefits, given that many of their siblings are native here?
I think it's worth looking at trees that do well in warmer, drier places. This is one of the things Joe McBride and I worked on a couple of years ago, was really looking at trees that function well today in places that are today warmer than, say, Los Angeles, that really have the climate that Los Angeles is predicted to have. So yes, I think it's very worthwhile looking at places that are warmer today, that really today have the climate that's predicted for, say, Los Angeles 50 years from now. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got another question from Ken. This is a technical question. Ken Fallsgraf, is the formation of tyloses reversible?
Yeah, so remember, tyloses are those bags that trees inflate inside their vessels to prevent the embolism from spreading. In some cases, yes, trees are able to essentially reabsorb them. Yeah, we thought it wasn't, but now there's evidence that yes, trees can reopen those embolized vessels. Yeah.
Great. One more on, I think, which will help us understand how Angelenos can engage, from Gregory Wright. Gregory says, a very large, grand tipuana trees in the parkway in front of my condo building, which I occasionally try to deep water with a hose as I lay across the sidewalk and leave running on trickle for several hours. Is this a good way to help the tree live throughout many more years?
Yeah, it is. So this idea of slowly watering the tree is a good one, because what you're doing, you're doing two things. You want to do two things and you want to avoid one thing. The thing you want to avoid is runoff, and runoff happens when we apply water too quickly. So runoff is not necessarily about too much water, it's about applying water too quickly, which is why applying water slowly is important. And some of those contractions that I showed the pictures of, that's what they do. They apply water slowly. The thing you want to do is you want to refill that water reservoir in the soil to the point where the tree can actually access the water. And we didn't go into this discussion of soil moisture and soil moisture levels, but the way it works is you have to kind of bump the soil moisture up above what's called the wilting point. So yes, you want to put it, for mature trees, you want to apply a significant slug of water, not very often, and you want to do it slowly.
Great. And our last question here is from Andy Lipkiss. He says, fantastic data, thank you. Can you please talk about the damage that happens specifically in year 3 and 4 of the drought that causes long-term unrecoverable damage?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So again, this is the big picture. You know, I not knowing the specifics. What I observed was this issue of carbon starvation. Essentially, the tree has depleted its energy reserves and it's just not able to generate new leaves. Because remember, even conifers, even evergreen trees need to generate a set of new leaves each year. Leaves don't last forever. And so if you don't have the carbon, you have to have the energy ready to go to make that happen. And if you don't have that energy because you couldn't make leaves the previous year or the year before or the year before, well, at some point you really just aren't able to make new leaves, which means you're not able to capture more energy. And that's really where that decline spiral really shows. It started earlier, but at that point it really shows visibly that tree is declining.
I think that's about all we have time for, but thank you so much, Dr. Lacan. What an honor to have you here. I'm going to pass it back over to Rachel.
Yeah, and I'll chime in. I definitely see an interest in our questions and a desire to see the remainder of your presentation, your dialogue on future water sources and other advice to us. And so I think we'll have to be asking you back. I know I've heard you speak at a couple other venues locally, and we may just have to see if we can get you to come to one of the lunch and learn sessions to talk as we start to grapple with how do we provide good messaging to the public? How do we think about the strategies for communicating about the importance of using water to preserve the lives of trees and help them get through that drought period, all of those different complexities, the water sources, the actors. So I'm putting it out there now. We're going to want to have you back to help us as we grapple with some of those things. But a huge thank you for sharing what you have.
Thank you.
And I love a deep dive with science. It's just so lovely to get into some of those details in a hopefully fairly approachable way for us. I love getting a refresher on some of that tree biology. So we're now going to head into our next group of speakers for the day, and this is the Urban Trees Initiative out of University of Southern California. I really wanted to say a huge thank you to Kate Weber and Dean Amber from the Public Exchange that have really coordinated this project and brought together such a fantastic project team from USC to help us look at our tree equity goals and how we can help plan for future investments in the urban forest. This project is really wonderful. It has so many different layers to it. And so I'm really thrilled that several members of the project team are here with us today to start to walk us through the project and some of the relevant information. So I will hand it over to our colleagues at USC. Well, while we're waiting for Kate and John and Esther to join us, and we will have the same presentation and Q&A, I will just add that one of the reasons this project was really important to me, especially to think about trees and water, is, again, that earlier commentary I made. Any investment we make in the urban forest has to be one that's really achieving benefits for our communities and the types of benefits that we know we need for the different neighborhoods. And so we want to be really thoughtful in the tree species we're selecting, in the locations we're looking at. And then another component of this project that I just would be remiss to not mention is the community engagement piece. And USC worked with the city and some of our engagement in the neighborhood that they researched here, but also included their own university relations team in putting out information and helping us engage with the community of this project area. And I don't know if Kate, if you're ready to take it away. While we're waiting, maybe Rachel, maybe we see if we get one more question for Igor.
Another Igor question. Let's see what we've got here.
If you're still with us, Igor.
I'm still here.
Okay.
Let's see. There's so many good ones. So yeah, this is maybe one geared more toward community members, but from Helen Toko. We have a lot of new trees in our community. How can the community assist in refilling the water bags for the new trees? I'm on the neighborhood council and chair of the Green Committee, and we can activate volunteers if that would be helpful. So yeah, just wanted to hear your thoughts on the community engagement side. I know you spoke mostly to the science, but wondering your thoughts there.
Yeah. So the watering bags are an excellent tool, not because it's magic, but because it reminds people that, you know, it's empty, it needs to be refilled. And for young trees, you're really looking at a very small amount of water that's going to be used up within days rather than weeks or months. So if you have a neighborhood council, the thing to do is to really go through, you're not refilling them every day, by the way, but you are looking at them at least once a week. And if it's, you know, August, September, really warm, Santa Ana winds kind of thing, you're looking at them multiple times a week and making sure that those trees are not turning crispy. You may have to check the soil under the tree. So, you know, it's not waterlogged, you know, it's not, you know, you're not applying too much water, but yeah, you want to be refilling those water bags pretty frequently. That's the biggest difference. If you let it go for weeks on end, you're going to end up with a crispy critter. And this is really where community members can make a giant difference.
Thanks for that. You said Krispy Kreme?
Crispy critters.
Okay.
That's a Larry Costello term that I really like.
I love it.
And I'll take some of the blame. We've often told professionals, you know, you want to apply a lot of water, you want to refill that soil water reservoir, but inadvertently we forgot to mention, well, that's really not how newly planted trees work. Their water reservoir is really small. So they need a lot, they don't need more water, they just need water more often.
Well, great. I'm glad we were able to squeeze in one more question. Thanks for being nimble with us. And we figured out the issue. We should now be ready to go with our USC team. Good to see you, Kate, and I'll hand the proverbial mic over to you.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Apologies, everyone, for the technical snafu there. My name is Kate Weber, and I am the director of the USC Dornsife Public Exchange, which is a new program that connects USC researchers with public and private partners to work collaboratively on social impact projects. I am so pleased to be here today with my USC colleagues, Dr. John Wilson, who is the founding director of the Spatial Sciences Institute at the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, and a professor of sociology and spatial sciences, and Professor Esther Margulies, who's a professor of the practice in landscape architecture and urbanism at the USC School of Architecture. We'll be talking about the USC Urban Trees Initiative, which is a collaboration between USC and the City of Los Angeles, generously supported by USC President Dr. Carol L. Foltz and the Dean of the Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, Amber Miller. Our USC team would also, of course, like to thank Mayor Garcetti for his leadership and for the ambitious goals he set in LA's Green New Deal that were the inspiration for this initiative. Next slide, please. The Urban Trees Initiative team is a team of 16 people from USC and the city of Los Angeles. On the USC side, our team includes faculty, staff, and students. We are represented by 2 schools, the Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, and the School of Architecture, 2 academic departments, Earth Sciences and Landscape Architecture and Urbanism, 3 centers and institutes, Public Exchange, the Spatial Sciences Institute, and the Carbon Census Network at USC, and 1 central university team, which is the Community and Local Government Partnerships team led by Dave Galaviz from USC's University Relations Office. On the City of LA side, our wonderful partners and the hosts of the event today are from the Department of Public Works. Next slide, please. Why are projects like the Urban Trees Initiative important, and why now? So as we heard in Dr. Lacan's presentation, extreme heat due to climate change is a growing concern. Here in Los Angeles, a statistic I think we're all unfortunately familiar with, the number of extreme heat days defined as temperatures of 95 degrees Fahrenheit or higher could rise to 40 days per year by 2060. LA already has some of the nation's worst air quality, and this is likely to worsen as temperatures rise. Unfortunately, the risk of exposure to extreme heat and air pollution varies inequitably across our LA neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that were a focus of this project, Lincoln Heights, El Sereno, and Ramona Gardens, all proximal to USC's Health Sciences campus, are at higher risk than wealthier zip codes due to poor canopy cover and the proximity of nearby freeways. Trees, I think as many folks here are familiar with, can play a significant role in air pollution mitigation and provide a host of other benefits, many of which have been mentioned already today. Just standing under a shaded tree can be up to 50% cooler. So that's why increasing shade in our most vulnerable neighborhoods is a matter of environmental justice and building resilient communities. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a sense of the project goals of phase 1 of the Urban Trees Initiative. And I say phase 1 because we're in the planning stages for phase 2, which is very exciting. And we'll talk about that closer to the end of today's presentation. But the goals of our phase 1, which kicked off in August 2020 and wrapped up last month when we released our findings, were to help the City of LA plan urban forestry efforts around USC Health Sciences campus in the neighborhoods of El Sereno, Ramona Gardens, and Lincoln Heights, determine where, how many, and what types of new trees could be added in this area, use our USC air quality sensors to test which tree species were most effective in absorbing pollutants, and share our research and data with our East Side neighbors. And Esther will talk a little bit later in the presentation about our community engagement work, but it was very important for us from the beginning of this project to understand the greening needs, preferences, priorities, and experiences with extreme heat in the areas that people were experiencing in the areas that we were working. Next slide, please. Our presentation today will really follow the outcomes of our project, beginning with a baseline assessment of the study site, a selection of 5 candidate sites and greening scenarios, the results of our preliminary scientific analysis of which tree species remove particulate matter, and of course, input and feedback from community organizations, leaders, and residents in the area. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. John Wilson, who will take us through the research. John?
Thank you, Kate. This is let me just start with a couple of other comments. Well, I appreciate both Igor's and Rachel's presentations and Kate's introduction here. I think collectively they show that details matter, and that, you know, more than anything, we can drive good decisions using science. And I would add that in the future, I think all things point to being able to use big data and science to drive decisions, but also to measure our performance. And in that sense, this is a really exciting new time. And the next thing is that, you know, as Kate's indicated, we were really interested in community engagement. There are many reasons for this, but one is there are lots of examples in the United States, around the world, where basically you build an urban forest and then immediately you see the neighborhood or the neighborhoods gentrify. And if we're a focus on equity, as I think we should, we need to keep the people in place, right? So that's super important. And ideally, you know, you want to co-develop plans and co-develop the implementation of plans and so forth. And in my mind, in order to do that, you really have to connect individual citizens with individual trees. This discussion and these plans and their implementation, these things are going to be very, very personal. So the study area here is about 5 square miles. You can see nestled in the southwest corner, the USC Health Sciences campus. And Kate, I think, has already introduced Lincoln Heights and El Sereno and Ramona Gardens as 3 distinct neighborhoods. And key to this area, we have the 10 freeway bounding the study area to the south, the 5 bounding it to the west. And you can see the 110 freeway crossing in the corner. Next slide, please. And so this is the HSC community, as we call it. And so here we have about 57,000 residents, nearly 4 out of 5 are Hispanic. 3/4 of the remainder are Asian in terms of race and ethnicity. A relatively young population, the median age is only 35. 1 in 5 are below 15, so they're children, but just over 1 in 10 are over 65. There's 15,500 households, so the households are relatively big, 3.6 people per household. But the median household income is relatively low, less than 50,000. 2 out of every 3 households are renters, or 6 out of 10. 4 out of 10 are homeowners. 15% of the households lack a vehicle. 71% of the households live below 300% of the federal poverty line. 28% of households spend more than 50% of their income on housing, whether it be rent or their mortgage. And importantly, 2/3 of the residents here have lived in the area for more than 10 years. So we have an established, diverse community with very modest income and a full range of people. Next, please. Various people have spoken about water, and I would say that when we're thinking about individual residents and individual trees and making this a personal conversation, the landscape tells us something about where water is going to congregate. And so this is a copy of maybe a 1920 or thereabouts topographic map sheet from the United States Geological Service. And you can see that we have hills that run across the north half of the study area. The bottom half, the south half, is largely flat though. And Lincoln Park, if you know that part of the city, has a man-made lake there now. But I bet before Europeans arrived, it was already an ephemeral wetland, just because of the shape of the terrain. Next. So we set about building a tree inventory. Some of this used existing data. The city is well along now in terms of building its own street tree inventory. So you can see these data incorporated here. But with my staff and a team of students, and using, given it was COVID, a lot of imagery sources, things like Google Street View and so forth, we set out to count every tree in this study area. And the stunning statistic here is we have 57,000 residents, but we only have 38,000 trees. So we have more people living in this 5 square miles than we have trees. There's not one tree for every person. Next. you know, we have to think about an urban forest on top of the fabric of the neighborhood. And so this is a map that we produced that show you single family residents, multifamily residents. They seem to be scattered everywhere. There's a large public housing initiative that's Ramona Gardens. There's some commercial and industrial that's changing rapidly. So there are opportunities there maybe. And then you can see a number of school campuses and parks and open space that we'll come back to. So there's a rich fabric here in which we have to think about this tree cover. Next. Now, one thing that Igor spoke to, and that's a bit of a problem here, is that the red here is impervious. So this is the surface of the neighborhood that's covered with concrete and asphalt or buildings, and the green is impervious. And so when we're thinking now about building a sustainable urban forest, and we're thinking about water sources and what other kinds of infrastructure we're going to need to support that forest, we have some particular challenges in parts of the city that look like this. Next. Some progress can be made with street trees. This is the street trees in the study area, and here we're showing trees per 100 feet of street or right of way. And the important thing to know about this particular part of the city and the street trees here is there's a relatively large number of street segments from one block to one intersection to the next intersection, where there are in fact no street trees currently. And so there's scope to expand the trees on public right-of-ways, but really we could do the same in terms of private property. Next. And you know, a place that we thought about to look at the start is in terms of the schools and the parks here and other open spaces. And so you can see that they're not equally dispersed across the study area, but more or less anywhere you look on the map, you can see examples. And these were featured in our scenarios. Next. So here's an example. These are the 14 parks. They vary tremendously in terms of size. They vary tremendously in terms of how many trees they have today. I think I understand that the average number of trees per acre in all of the parks in the city of LA is some number around 12. And in this particular part of the city, that number using these data here is only 6. So we're about half the city average. So that's an equity question right there. And in particular, if you look at, in terms of our public engagement, many people we spoke to talked about Rose Hill Park and Ascot Hills Parks as two relatively large parks that have very low tree counts. And therefore they afford no shade, which in Southern California is increasingly important. So I want to switch gears now with the next slide and talk for a minute about the science. And so science here could help us decide which trees should be planted to mitigate heat and air pollution. Another question science could help with is where and in what numbers and configurations should the trees be planted to achieve the desired outcomes. And what kinds of outcomes will the community experience throughout the life of this urban forest? Because an urban forest is really an investment, right? And if you want a sustainable urban forest, the plan can't be to plant it all next year, because you're just going to create a crash and burn cycle in perpetuity that way. And so this needs some very careful thought, and you need to be thinking out how you're going to systematically build an urban forest where you get to some sustainable level of forest that can be renewed in roughly the same amounts every year. But there's very little literature and science that's been completed in Mediterranean climates like Southern California that would advise or provide answers to these kinds of questions. So next, please. So we've done some preliminary work which we plan to deepen in the next phase of our project, and this is my colleague Will Berenson from the Earth Sciences Department. So here we're looking at a small part of the Ramona Gardens section of the study area. The 10 freeway is in the bottom of the kind of image map that's displayed here. We have a control site where we have one of our monitors attached to a building. And then on a series of days, we've taken and looked at what happened to air quality under trees that were in each case are different species. So next. And so the control monitor is the blue one here. And in this case, we're showing the air quality monitored under the cypress tree. And in general, but not always, you see that the air quality under the cypress tree is running a little bit better in terms of PM 2.5 than next to a building on our control monitor. These are just preliminary data. We were really interested in testing our sensors to see whether they could pick up signals. We probably haven't done as good a job as we need to in terms of managing airflow and using that to interpret and help understand our results. But so far, in this case, using a few days of data, it seemed like the cypress tree was better than a Palo Verde, that was better than a Holyoke, and Holyoke and Tipu Tipu are roughly the same. But this is using the city's new tree list. This is work we plan to continue and do in more detail in the next phase. So with that, next slide. So we then set about developing some greening priorities, because if you want to co-develop a new future with the community, you have to be able to give them a sense of what that new future might be like. And so in order to do this, we picked 4 criteria. They're not about the trees necessarily, they're about the community. So we looked for the areas that had the most people over 65 or under 15 years of age. We looked for the areas that had median household income less than 45,000, so at the lower end of the distribution you find in this city neighborhood. We looked for places that had relatively high population density, more than 15,000 people per square mile. And we looked for households that had a high percentage of people, because they had no vehicle, that were committed to walking or commuting by bus. And so these 4 colored areas here, 2 in Lincoln Heights, 1 in the northeast corner in El Sereno, and 1 next to Ramona Gardens, were in our mind, the way in which we tried to focus and look for areas in which we could illustrate greening scenarios. And for that part of the talk, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Esther Margulies.
Thanks, John. And thanks for mentioning the importance of connecting data to people. We also need to help people to envision the benefits that can be provided by these trees and urban forests in their own neighborhoods. And based on some big data and time actually spent in these neighborhoods, John and I had some lovely walks around the neighborhood, in the parks and in the areas of housing. We developed 5 typological scenarios to illustrate existing conditions in these areas that lack urban forest equity, in street parkways, a local park, local elementary schools, and in a low-income community with great potential for a denser, healthier urban forest. And today we're going to share our research on the first 3 sites, looking at opportunities so that we can assist communities in achieving equity and climate resilience. Next slide, please. So the first 2 scenarios involved parkways, which is traditionally where we look at street trees and public trees. We also did some work on private property opportunities, but we thought for this presentation we'll focus on the public realm. So in our study, we identified 2 parkway conditions. These inequities are present in neighborhoods where we actually do have the necessary infrastructure of wide parkways that can support large canopy shade trees, which really are the answer to providing substantial trees in our neighborhoods. These substantial trees will provide shade, carbon storage, air filtration, significant rainwater detention, increased habitat and biodiversity, all of these adding additional resilience value. And in this case, which happened to be up in the northeastern portion of our study area, we confirmed that yes, there are streets that have ample parkway space for large shade trees that will have no impacts on on-street parking or other inconveniences. Our on-the-ground analysis provided us with a model for estimating the quantity and impact of potential additional street trees in similar cases. And one of the summaries and maps that John has and his team developed shows us just how many areas we have with these kinds of parkways in our study area, so we can begin to really get a handle on Where is the low-hanging fruit? Where, through the removal of existing concrete, through programs to support tree planting and maintenance, where can we begin planting these large species? Next slide, please. But more of, whoops, sorry, could you get back one, please? Thank you very much. Many more of the streets, and at least in our study area and all over the city, are areas with limited, very, very limited shade canopy, have much narrower existing parkways and much more limited potential for effective life-saving shading and ecosystem services. Our current standards in these kinds of conditions where there's a 3-foot parkway only allow for very small trees. And we need to be more ambitious and creative. We need to find more space for large, healthy root zones, for large, healthy trees. So you'll notice we don't have specific tree species identified at this point because we're working in tandem with Rachel and her team and the other research to define a new list of trees that will be climate resilient and ready to go and provide these benefits. Next slide, please. So the previous slides that you saw showed some existing conditions and possible locations for new large trees that actually could create a well-shaded street that I want to call, and we have slow streets now, which are better and safer and more pleasant, but what we need in this time of incoming and oncoming extreme heat is we need truly cool streets. And I hope that everyone will want to live on a cool street in the future. Because we have extreme heat coming and we know it's not going to double, it may even triple the number of extreme heat days over 95 degrees in the next 20 years. So these areas we found in our measurements on September 15th last year, one of the hottest days of the year, that the areas of the street, just simply in the street surface, the sidewalks, and even on lawns in these areas can be up to 30 degrees warmer than under the shade of a mature tree. And it's not just an issue of what's happening outside. In many of the neighborhoods where John and I walked, we saw many houses that have very limited air conditioning. So that temperatures inside the living space can be 100 degrees, 115 degrees. And our urban canopy can become community cooling resources for everyone in dense, low income, in neighborhoods that need shade. And we can provide this shade actually in a carbon negative way without using fossil fuels, without generating greenhouse gas emissions through air conditioning. But you may be saying, or you might be thinking, this is all very nice, but we don't have room for these trees. I mean, we look at these streets and we think they're already pretty tightly packed. But the fact is, and when you get down to a very fine-grained granule level and you really look at how can we find the space, and you really think about which parts, what square feet in the streets are actually legally useful for parking, what we found is there are areas where you can't park vehicles. It's not feasible between the driveway spacing, utilities, no parking zones. We have space in the street itself that can be used to create ample, healthy root zone for large trees. Now, it's not going to be easy, it's not going to be inexpensive, and it's going to mean change for a lot of people, but I firmly believe that cool streets can be a cost-effective and carbon negative cooling system to provide public benefits. Next slide. So we also looked at a condition in Hazard Park, specifically adjacent to our HSC campus, one of the larger parks in this neighborhood. And what we focused on here in Hazard Park was not only cooling, how can we make these parks without sacrificing any of the uses that they currently have? How can we increase the urban forest to actually make them more comfortable, more attractive places during these periods of extreme heat? And where we have ample space, how can we begin to spatially think about creating air pollution, particulate matter sponges, especially in neighborhoods that are close to freeways? And that is definitely something that has a huge impact on the neighborhoods in which we're looking, because they're surrounded by the 10 freeway, the 5 freeway, there's just too many to count. And the air pollution is, it may not be visible on an everyday basis, but this is a significant health concern in these neighborhoods. Next slide. So these are just a couple of comparisons looking at what I call, on the left side, the bring your own shade approach to parks in our neighborhoods, where there are very few trees. They don't serve us very well for when we want to be in the shade of a tree. And through strategic planting with strategic species, we can create well-shaded resources for literally hundreds or thousands of people who may need to get out of extreme heat. And it will be a health crisis. Next slide, please. Kate Weber mentioned that Dave Galaviz and Dulce Acosta from our community relations office were a very large part of this project, and we could not have done it without them. For many of us who do research and practice, we do these kinds of projects locked up in a library, a classroom, a research laboratory. This was a different kind of project and a different kind of partnership. Making sure that we were actually out there on the site, meeting with Northeast Trees, working directly with Rachel Malrich and Melinda and other representatives of the city and our community relations team. And what they brought to this equation was their many years of deep relationships with the neighborhoods in which we wanted to do this study. So we met with these community groups. We listened actively to their concerns. It was super helpful to have Rachel and others from the city there to respond directly to concerns and questions. And then when we came back, next slide, to share with them our research and our findings, we were so pleased to find not just a welcome, but an enthusiastic support for these kinds of studies, this kind of partnership, leveraging the research resources at USC in really building strong and supportive partnerships with communities to achieve equitable community forests and health benefits. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Kate Weber to talk about next steps.
Thanks, Esther. So you can access our full research findings as well as executive summaries in English and Spanish on our public exchange website, as well as more information about the project and maps of the study zones and a wealth of information generated from phase 1. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it's very exciting for us. We are in the early planning stages for a phase 2 of this work. And phase 2 will include a geographic expansion of the work we've described today, as well as a significant expansion of the research around tree species and air pollution mitigation. So I've seen a number of folks in the chat today comment and make some suggestions about geographies that would make sense to include, and we appreciate those suggestions. Please keep them coming. We are in the planning stages currently to identify these geographies for phase 2. We are also planning to significantly expand our efforts to engage community organizations that could use our research and data to plan their urban forestry projects in these areas. I'm sure that describes a number of folks in the audience today, and we're so thrilled to have such an engaged audience. We'd love to hear from anyone who's interested in learning more about the initiative or coordinating with us. Our contact information is on our site, and I believe Mariana from our team has dropped it into the chat. So don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to hear from you and get your suggestions and ideas. And I think with that, thank you so much for listening to our team today. And I think we're ready to go to the Q&A portion.
And I think we may have time for one. I'm going to address a couple of them maybe in a moment of commentary here. One thing I'll add to the phase 2, which we are so excited for, is that we'll probably be adding some additional city staff and departments to the next phase of the project. This first one was a pretty small part of the city team. We'll have a broader discussion there. And I just want to add that the work done by this fantastic team at USC, along with the Visiting Scholar Project with Vivek Chandas and that team, both are offering us some really interesting thoughts, perspective, justification for having some serious conversations about public space, like the types of modifications Esther was describing. And the next task of the city is to take a lot of those thoughts, commentaries, recommendations, in addition to what you all are providing in the Q&A today, back to the drawing board and say, where should we start thinking about some trade-offs? How can we have those conversations to maximize, again, tree benefits and manage all the other needs in these public spaces? So I really appreciate the robust conversation that's been happening in the Q&A and presentation by the research team. I'm gonna see if we have time for maybe one question. I think you answered again. I think we had a very specific project area for this, but that doesn't mean that other areas are not going to be included. And I will also just flag one thing I didn't add in my opening is we've been working closely with LA County, because the county and the city, we recognize that the urban forest doesn't know where those boundaries are, and coordination across our respective jurisdictions is going to be essential to urban forest health moving forward in our region. I don't know, Kate or John, if you had specific questions that were standing out to you, or a final thought.
I didn't. Okay.
I think, John, there was a question in the chat about whether we weighted the criteria equally for prioritization. Maybe that's something we could address.
Yeah, the answer was yes. And, you know, I think going forward, maybe to cut off another set of questions, is I'm not convinced that they would be the best 4 criteria or that they should be weighted equally. And so I think we will likely give that some more thought.
Great. And I see also a number of comments around, again, some policies around setbacks, again, about some of these trade-offs that we need to discuss within the city family of, again, meeting different needs for housing and, again, use of public space and public safety, which is, again, the urban forest manager on the city side. We're wearing a risk manager hat as part of that. We want a healthy urban forest and a public that has access to the other amenities that are needed. And I do see notes about mature trees being maintained kind of across our dialogue this morning, and I really appreciate that. As any of you who have heard me speak before know, I talk about the 4 pillars of urban forest management that all need investment: preservation, maintenance, planting, and community engagement. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it to our next team. Thank you so much, Esther, John, Kate, and again, that full extended team. I look forward to having you share more work with our city stakeholders in the future, and maybe having you at a future lunch and learn to dive into some of the specifics of the renderings you provided, Esther, and answer some more questions. With that, we're going to go ahead and move on to the Westwood Greenway project. And I'm thrilled to be able to pass.
Yeah, Councilmember Paul Gratz, and I can't tell you how pleased I am to be part of the Tree Summit, showcasing our excellent and groundbreaking Westwood Neighborhood Greenway project. This project has been such a strong and innovative collaboration between my office and our city departments and the community members on the Westwood Greenway Steering Committee. The vision and expertise of the steering committee has been so strong and so aligned with the work my office does on biodiversity. We have as an office been able to let them lead the way while supporting where needed. Most projects aren't that lucky. What we did have to help with in particular was in raising the funds to get it built and getting the Expo Line board to approve a native plant landscaping palette for the metro portion of the project, which was not quite as easy as you might think, but we got it done. Given the challenges we face with climate breakdown and biodiversity loss, as with all city projects, I believe we can either make things better or make things worse. The Westwood Greenway project daylights and cleans polluted street water runoff before putting it into the Santa Monica Bay, which is essential to meet the city's Clean Water Act responsibilities, but it also provides native plant habitat for the creatures we share the city with. It provides milkweed to help the struggling monarch butterflies who migrate through. And given its proximity to the Expo Line station, it provides educational opportunities for Expo Line riders and also for school kids around the city. So they can all understand how vitally important a project like this is and why they need to grow up and advocate for more of them wherever in Los Angeles they live.
So we're here at the Westwood Neighborhood Greenway, which is an area that saved land from development and pavement and ended up being a natural area within the center of West LA. It came about because it was going to be used for a train, possibly, and we wanted to find every possible purpose we could put it to. It's now cleaning water, and it's a place for native plants and trees to be seen and to educate people about what used to be here and what can be saved for the future. Back in 2011, I was working in a city role reviewing plans for the Expo Phase 2. And at that time, just about every square foot of what is now the Greenway was targeted for being paved over and used for cars. The area behind me was being contemplated for a special parking lot for the use of residents because about 12 parking spaces on Westwood had been lost due to the train coming, even though all the homes in this area are single-family homes that have garages and driveways. Instead of that surface parking today, we have this beautiful section of the Greenway. When I went to the mayor's office, I met Greg Spots, among other people, and we got to be in touch with him at every point in the project, including what are we going to do to keep this from being a parking lot that was planned here. Metro didn't know how much ridership there was. People who didn't understand trains thought they needed cars to get to trains, not buses or walking or biking or like that on the other side. So if it wasn't for Greg and people in his office, what you'd be looking at is a parking lot, because this belonged to General Services and had been laid out by this neighborhood as a street. I'm now on the northeastern portion of the Greenway, and this part as well was targeted for being paved over for cars. The elementary school behind me lost a couple of parking spaces due to the traction power station over here. And so they were asking if this parcel of land could become a special parking lot for their teachers. We resisted, and what you see today is the result of protecting this area from being paved over. These informational signs are here to teach people from toddler to adult how the ecosystem works, from the soil getting activated by plants rather than under turf, under grass, or that won't be happening. So it goes from mycorrhizae to ants to lizards, all the way up to hawks, the predator hawks, which will be nesting in these trees as they get larger. We will have kids coming here, adults walking to the train, whether it's a field trip or someone just passively learning.
The tree behind me is a California sycamore. This This is another tree that's perfect for a water environment. It loves to have its roots in water. This tree can go up to about 120 feet tall. And so right now you see it with the green leaves, and that's a perfect example of what it should be. Fully leafed out, not water stressed. And so this is a great tree for large landscapes that are well irrigated. All right, here's another California native, one of my favorites. This is Coast Live Oak, and that could live for hundreds and hundreds of years. California native, beautiful evergreen tree, and it's home to a lot of insects. Squirrels love the nuts. The Native Americans used to make porridge out of the meal from that tree. Very valuable.
I'm now 3 blocks west of the Westwood Station on the Expo Phase 2 bike path. And I wanted to show you that this here is an existing greenway we already had called the Sarah Berman Greenway. And these mature trees here pre-existed the Expo line. And we were able to preserve this greenway when we built the Expo line over here and the Expo line bike lane that I'm walking on right now. And so part of the greatness of the Westwood Greenway is it's an extension of a greenway that already existed, so that we have about 7 blocks of beautiful greenery going all the way from Overland almost to Sepulveda over here.
That was terrific. This is Greg Spots here. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hey, Jonathan. Greetings from Manhattan. I'm in my dad's apartment on East 57th Street. I'm on vacation, but I really wanted to join all of you guys. At first we thought about just making a 5-minute video about the Westwood Greenway, but as we talked to people and made the video, there were so many interesting issues and topics that emerged that we decided to make our whole concluding segment of today's Tree Summit about this topic. It almost feels like a black swan event. How did we, in a very dense part of the city where real estate values are extremely high, $1 million a parcel when there's no house on it, maybe $1.5 million, how did we find a way to increase nature in a fully built out part of the city? It still feels a little bit like a miracle to me. Before we begin, I wanted to just ask Councilmember Koretz to make a very brief tribute to 2 community members who passed away during the project's design and construction.
Well, good morning, everyone. I want to do something that we don't often do at city events. First, I want to acknowledge that we in the Westwood Greenway are located on traditional and unceded Tongva territory. I believe it's important to recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous people on this land, and particularly in relation to the Westwood Greenway project. And with that, I want to acknowledge 2 people who were integrally involved in the project in different ways, both of whom we sadly lost over the past year. First, Julia Bogany, who was a Tongva elder who guided us as we developed Tongva signage, acknowledging their long and continued history here, and who led us in a land acknowledgement and prayers when we broke ground for the project. She had an amazing spirit and taught so many of us so much about the right relationship to the land. The other person I want to acknowledge and remember, who was not Tongva, by the way, but had a similar spirit, is Sarah Hayes, who was one of the earliest supporters of bringing a light rail along this abandoned railroad right-of-way through the neighborhood and worked hard to help build the necessary community support to make it happen. Once the Expo line was approved, Sarah actively worked as part of the Westwood Greenway Steering Committee, to ensure the project included native plant landscaping and advocated what she thought would be the best pedestrian and bicycle connections to the station. I'm pleased to say she was able to see the Westwood Greenway and its water cleaning equipment in full operation during her final week. I want to dedicate our discussion of this terrific project today to the memory of both of these incredible women.
Thank you so much, Councilman. And Sarah and I served on the Expo Line Phase 2 design review committee, which was an organized board to provide input on design. And she was an extremely insightful and articulate advocate for urban design. And I learned a lot from her. And she's also a really terrific person and a very, very pleasant and wonderful person to be with. So we have a lot we want to talk about, and we can get to more if we're all like super brief. So maybe we think of it as like sort of a couple of lightning rounds of, very short answers to these prompts I'm going to ask. Let's start with community member Jonathan Weiss, who I've known for a decade now or more. Jonathan, when was the first time you heard of the possibility of doing something with the 50 feet of right-of-way on either side of Metro's 100 feet of right-of-way in between Overland and Westwood?
Well, with Sarah, who you mentioned, and Annette, we were advocates for the Expo line. And there was a question of it possibly going under Overland Avenue at the east, and turned out there was a storm drain there. And instead of that just being a barrier, we looked at that as possibly being an opportunity to clean the water before it went to the ocean.
And who did you escalate that to? When that idea came up, how did you go about, just like, what was your first stop?
Comments on the EIR. One of the groups that read it, the NRDC, Damon Degami, cold emailed us saying, hey, can we do that? Went to Sheila Keel's office. We had a letter about a week later or a month later supporting it. Put up a website. Paul Koritz is running for office. Can you sit down with me and take a look at this? And he did. So
when was this, Jonathan?
Well, this all started about 14 years ago. I don't remember when Paul was running, but I do remember before he was in, our council member wasn't as much of an environmentalist. I went to Jan Perry's office. She said she had an environmental deputy. It might've been that deputy who sent us to treat people. They were loaded up, but not too busy to give us good advice, which was go see Raise Airport Sanitation and future-proof it. And sanitation was able to do that because there's no way to do this after the train went in. We wouldn't have been able to get the culverts under the train.
So Ryan from sanitation, how did sanitation receive this idea, and how was it consistent with some broad environmental goals that the department already had? Well, next time you want to go out there, I'll buy you a coffee. I live right near there. Annette, how did you jump on this train, and what excited you when you learned about this project?
Unmute.
Geez, I work at a school. You'd think I'd know that. It all started at our neighborhood school. We were all parents at the same school, which is right across the street from the Greenway. Sarah and I were both doing gardening and landscaping at the school. We knew Jonathan from the train stuff and anything to do with plants and the environment. Now I teach science at the school. So, you know, count me in.
Excellent. Well, I remember you, and I haven't seen your face in a long time. Good to see you. Well, I'll answer my own question too. You know, I had just started a job as the Mayor Villaraigosa's Director of Transportation Project Delivery. There was the 405 Sepulveda Pass widening, the Expo Phase 2, finishing Expo Phase 1, the Crenshaw LAX light rail, the regional connector, and the West Side Purple Line subway extension. And they were all kind of emerging around the same time in different stages. And all these different city agencies were commenting on the plans. And sometimes the city agencies provided conflicting comments. You know, BOE, Bureau of Engineering, would say, you know, you need a really big moat around this column for the overpass to protect the column from traffic. And DOT would say, no, we need another traffic lane there. We need a very skinny little area around the column. And then nobody knew how to resolve these things. So Metro actually paid for my salary for me to move from one part of Villaraigosa's office to the other to try to kind of coordinate the city's response to these projects that were collectively about $10 billion worth of projects. And the Expo was really interesting to me because I lived in Santa Monica and I had been aware of Friends for Expo for many years and been watching the project evolve. And it just so happened that Expo Phase 2 was sort of about to enter the design process in mid-2011 when I took on this new role. And because the role was new, what it was really for hadn't been really concretized yet. And as I kind of explored certain things going on with Expo Phase 2 at Palms and at Westwood, I started to think that my new job could be an urban design role as well as just making sure the department's bickering could be resolved in a timely way. That it could be more than just an expediter through the Byzantine city system, but perhaps expressing some kind of coherent thought about urban design. And just as I aspired to maybe contribute that, I sort of got to know about this project and these competing visions of what was on the plans from sanitation and what certain community members wanted. And literally taking all of this land and paving it and making it all parking. It just felt like exactly where we were in LA in 2011. Like on this very spot, we were going to have the fight that had been brewing, you know, about is our land to be asphalted over and made for car storage, or is it to be for something that is more serving people and nature and how people and nature work so beautifully together? And so I became very passionate about the project and trying to kind of block and tackle on behalf of the project. And I didn't really know what I was getting into. The naivete of being new in the job maybe helped me think that this was possible. So let's talk a little bit about, Ryan, can you tell us a little bit about the specific opportunity pertaining to stormwater, the storm drain that's on one side and what the kind of idea was about what you could do with that stormwater? Well, there was one critical part that maybe you could tell me about, is that the design was to bring the water westward along the north side, run a culvert under where the rail was going to be, so that you could bring the water back eastward on the south parcel. And wasn't like the critical path getting that culvert in before the rail came? You know, there's something, maybe I can ask Councilmember Koretz about this. You know, Councilmember, you're very experienced with city process and driving projects. When you were attending at that moment and we put in that culvert, Councilmember, did you think that, okay, great, you know, another successful project that's now underway? Or did you think it was some kind of miracle that we'd gotten there?
Well, I think it's somewhere in between. It was very difficult from the start, and the start really was, as Jonathan said, when he pitched this idea to me. I'm trying to remember exactly when, probably late 2008 or early 2009 during my first election. I thought it was a very promising idea, but the city was also pretty broke during our Great Recession. We were able to make some significant inroads early that weren't as costly, including getting the Greenway listed as one of Rec and Park's 50 Parks initiatives, and part of that. And also, as was mentioned, the absolutely critical installation of the culverts in a timely fashion. But then, honestly, the funding was the hard part. And it certainly took a while, but with the help of Andy Schrader, my hardworking environmental director, we had to move mountains to get the project before the Santa Monica Bay Restoration Commission and then the State Water Resources Control Board, both of whom voted for $2.2 million in funding for the project. And then the committees overseeing the city's Prop O Clean Water Bond provided the rest of the matching funds, and then we were funded. And I should take the opportunity to thank everybody who helped move things forward, from Mayor Garcetti and his team to Supervisor Sheila Kuehl to Enrique Zaldivar and Ryan Thieha. and the sanitation team, and Gary Lee Moore and his team at the Bureau of Engineering, John Reamer and his team at the Bureau of Contract Administration and Public Works Inspections, and then City Commission President Kevin James, and now Public Works Commission President Greg Good, who oversaw the project for Public Works. And many thanks also, as has been noted, to our moderator, Greg Spots, who really did the critical early work to keep this greenway from becoming an asphalt parking lot, which obviously would never have allowed this then to be built. It's been a long slog, but one of sanitation's staffers reminded me that the average city project like this typically takes about 10 years. So from that point of view, we came pretty close to that and have done pretty well.
Let me ask, thank you so much. Let me ask Jonathan and Annette, what would be your advice to community members anywhere in the city who have an idea for some kind of greenway or wildlife corridor?
Well, Greg, let me try to answer that. And there was another question that came up as well. Not everyone throughout the city has the time to spend on things like this. Thankfully, my wife's a full-time teacher and supports me. I'm a lawyer on the side. But one thing that we've done, I think I'm most proud of, is we've set new standards, best management practices that have to be followed. So if you're somewhere else in the city and you say, why is this on the west side? Why don't we have this? You can point to it when, in our case, Metro came in and said, we're going to fulfill best management practices. We're going to meet these standards. It wasn't the level it is. There weren't green streets. Sanitation wasn't able to do this. It is now part of what they do. So I think we've provided a model. In my case, I was able to get involved and get people like Annette and other community members around. Ryan wasn't just a city employee. He was there. He's working for the city because he wants to save the world. Silly as that may sound, I think you're in the same boat. Find people like that in government who are what I call civil servants, and try to work with them.
Yeah, and I would add on, I mean, definitely get a group of people because you can't do it by yourself. And you have to have enough people to last for a long time because it's going to take 10 years or more. You got to keep pushing. But we got a lot of good ideas. We went around, we did a bunch of field trips to other similar facilities. We saw some other parts of the city down near the LA River. And, maybe there's even more now, but just keep getting out there and seeing what other ideas there are out there, I think too helped a lot.
Excellent. Well, maybe we have time for a couple questions. One of my colleagues is going to surface those. Melinda or Rachel or one of you guys looking for questions in the comment boxes, or should I ask one last round of questions?
Absolutely. I think we had tagged Rachel, the other Rachel, but here we are. I see a number of really great questions on this, and I appreciate, Jonathan, you're already addressing one of them in terms of having those best management practices. Actually, Greg, I'm not seeing a clear one that rises to the surface for me. So maybe one more question from you.
Okay. So outside of a rail right of way, maybe each panelist can just tell me a noun, whatever, another kind of place that might present an opportunity for wildlife corridor. Council member, you want to start?
Well, I've had a project which has been going almost as long as this to try to create wildlife corridors in the hillsides in Los Angeles. Because every time we build a home, we block the connectivity, and eventually we'll eliminate all of the species that most people don't realize are in our hillsides, from mountain lions to bobcats on down. So that is a critical effort, along with our efforts to create more biodiversity citywide, to create healthy parks and protected tree initiatives. And hopefully all of that helps move us in the same direction to make this a greener Los Angeles, and even an example for other places in LA County and across the country.
Ryan, do you think that even cities around the world can use their stormwater management as a lever to actually create more nature at the surface? Excellent. Jonathan, will you tell everybody how they can stay in touch with developments about the Greenway?
Well, the westwoodgreenway.org website is probably the best way. We've set up a nonprofit to support what Ryan once said about the project. It does clean water. That's why it's funded for one purpose. The other is it's educational. SMBRC required a certain number of educational signs. We would love it if people come out, use it as an outdoor classroom. Audubon's already doing that. And Arborists for the City said the same thing. It is a great place to teach the lessons we heard at this wonderful presentation today. I commend you for doing this, Greg, and the city staff. It's been wonderful.
Well, thank you very much. Annette, do you have an idea of another kind of place if you're a science teacher? What's another kind of place in the busy concrete jungle we live in where we could put some more native plants and trees?
Well, I would say schools, because there should be one in every neighborhood. They usually have streets that have gutters and swales and whatever. There are some schools that already have some native open place. I know Walgrove Elementary in the Mar Vista's Venice area. I'm pretty sure there's one near downtown LA too, but I can't think of the name of it. But it does also sort of then challenge the whole issue of maintenance. And I saw a lot of comments in the chat about, or in the Q&A about maintenance. And, you know, I'm so amazed at the number of organizations and city departments and agencies, but that are involved in trees and want to promote trees, but maintenance is expensive. It's not fun. It's not sexy. Even just pruning your street tree is several $100s, you know? And so keeping the irrigation, are you putting that on the school district, you know? So there's some challenges there, but it's certainly, you know, if there was native landscaping at every school, that would provide a nice necklace of open space throughout the city.
Those asphalt playgrounds at school are like car culture gone wild. Like, whoever thought that would be the best thing for our children? Hey, we gave you a parking lot with no cars, go play.
But grass is hard to maintain. You know, you got 500 stamping on.
Let's take a petroleum product and cover the school grounds with it, because it's easy to maintain.
Yep.
Oh my goodness.
That's
and it's non-porous for rainwater infiltration either.
And yep.
Wow.
If I could add one thing, Greg, even the Expo line, Greenway itself, we are still struggling to come up with funding sources for adequate maintenance. And certainly all our folks that work on that need additional education. I know, for instance, milkweed, which is critical for monarch butterflies, looks like just another weed. So I think it has occurred where people have removed it thinking it was a weed. We clearly need to do the education and training, and we need to find the funding for adequate maintenance.
Well, thank you. And it wouldn't be a bad time to say it in your last year. I've really enjoyed working with you, Council Member, and it's been a great collaboration.
It's been a great pleasure working with you on this, and thank you for your significant role, and it's been great working with all the folks in the community that have helped as a group to make this happen.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I'll pass it to our intrepid host, Rachel Malorich, to close us up. And thank you, everybody, for having me join from far away. I really didn't want to miss it.
We appreciate you squeezing it in when you should have been taking a break. And I appreciate this final section just being such a refreshing opportunity, one, to start that video looking at the green space, and then hearing about the process and the challenges and, you know, this real success and what we can learn from it. And I will be brief. I just put into the chat, but we're going to be using all the comments and questions that you all have been putting forward today just to add to the context as we move forward with solutions for our urban forest. And that's kind of where I want to leave it today. I'm feeling really full. I'm ready for lunch, but I'm feeling full on the content side, and really appreciate all of our participants today, both you from the public and all of the panelists that join us. And I'm cautiously hopeful that maybe we get to do this in person next year, so we can maybe eat together like we did at the first summit and have some robust discussion around the room in one of our park settings or another city facility. But with that, I'm really pleased to be able to turn it over to our council member, Bob Blumenfield, who's the chair of the Public Works Committee and a huge advocate for our urban forest, to close us out. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Rachel. Thank you for that. And Greg, it was great hearing you moderate this panel, and Councilmember Koretz as well. And I want to say, I hope we're saying goodbye to you this year, but I hope that that's not the case. There are lots of other ways that you're going to be very much involved with this city and with the trees in this upcoming year. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this year's Tree Summit. Please continue to stay engaged, because community participation and advocacy ensures that your city government makes urban forestry a priority and makes our whole urban forest a priority. As you mentioned, I'm chair of the city's Public Works Committee, and I'm vice chair of the Budget Finance Committee. And as such, I've been a strong advocate for additional resources to enhance our urban forest. And I should say, long before I was ever in elected office, I've been focused on these issues, on water and the environment. In fact, my first job out of college, I worked for a group called Clean Water Action. I was an annoying telemarketer for them. And I also did environmental legislation when I would work on Capitol Hill. Really, every job I've had has had an environmental component. I used to work for the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy for a number of years. And so I have a passion for our local environment, and the importance of trees has deep roots within me. So the theme of this year's event, Trees and Water, is a good one. And as a council member, for the West San Fernando Valley neighborhoods that are the hottest parts of the city, areas like Woodland Hills and Canoga Park, I'm keenly aware of the importance of ensuring adequate water supplies for our trees. It doesn't take very long for anything to dry out here in the West Valley. And unfortunately, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, the city's urban forestry budget and staffing were cut to the bone, or I should say, for you tree enthusiasts, it was cut to the phloem. Anyway, over the same period, drought and disease were stressing and killing many of our trees, especially in the hottest part of the city, as I mentioned. And as a consequence, just a few years ago, we had more employees, or just as many employees, removing dead trees and stumps as there were planting and watering trees. Not the way you want to do it. Fortunately, we flipped the script in the past few years, and I've successfully fought with others to increase the urban forestry budget, to add watering and tree trimming, to ensure that our young trees are established and our mature trees stay healthy. We've established, obviously, the position of a city forest officer and begun to really think more strategically about our urban forest. So all that is extremely positive. And as we in California seem to be entering another drought, it's just more critical than ever for our city to plan for water shortages and to devote adequate resources to our trees. I really appreciate that StreetsLA is looking at the urban forest also through an equity lens, because we know that the trees, they clean the air, they cool the streets. Neighborhoods with trees, they prevent water pollution, they provide shade for pedestrians, among the many other benefits. And this is something that all Angelinos should experience and should expect. But the reality is, if you go to Griffith Park or you go to some other high point in our city and look out from the mountaintop, and look across the city, you can tell an area's affluence in many respects by the tree canopy. There's a direct proportion. My hope and my vision for Los Angeles is that won't be the case in the future, that one day we're going to be able to look out from any of those vistas, and every part of the city will have a dense tree canopy, in terms of whatever the development pattern and environmental conditions allow, but that we're gonna create those dense tree canopies all around. It will happen, and it'll happen because of the people here on this call. While you were talking, I was scanning the list of people who were here, and I saw so many people that I knew and so many that I don't, but I'm excited by the numbers of folks who are interested in trees and who are going to focus on our canopy and on water and trees. So thank you for continuing to green the city of Los Angeles, strengthening our urban forest, and for being part of this and letting me say a few words here at the end as you close. So thanks again and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Councilmember Blumenfield. It's such a great collaboration working with you, building up urban forestry we had less than 100 positions after the budget crisis. I mean, how can you take care of 700,000 street trees with 94 people? And now we have maybe 225. I mean, it's just an incredible turnaround, but we're not rebuilding the old urban forestry division. We're rebuilding a modern one that is a tablet wielding group, updating the maintenance record of each tree in Davy Treekeeper. It's really quite something. All right, well, I guess that's the end of our program. And yes, next year we shall break bread in person.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.